thank you very much for sharing that experience with us. And now we will move on to our third and final speaker, Caroline, after which we will have our discussion. So do keep your questions in your mind, write them down, pop them in the chat, and we'll be coming to those later. But for now, Caroline, we are all ears and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Just to say a massive thank you to Linda and Fiona, who have answered many of the questions that I'm raising within my presentation. So I feel like there'll be a lot of fruitful discussion afterwards. So yeah, as David said, my name's Caroline Downey and I work for both Women Working Worldwide, and I've also worked as a consultant into Flowers. So those are the sort of things that are driving my perspective. And I just need to say that for me, it was very difficult in order to put together a presentation. And as I've said here, I'm not sure whether they are tools of control or protecting workers' rights. And I would say that over the last few years, obviously, there have been huge changes in the way that workers are protected. And I'm particularly interested in diving much more deeper into the wine trade and finding out about Linda's. So the next slide, please. So I was asked to touch on, I know Linda's covered this as well, why women, and obviously across the world, and this is from World Economic Forum, and they are doing some work over the last few years looking at the gender gap. And as you can see, we're moving backwards. So on a global level, it's going to take around about 136 years to close the overall gap. And personally, for me, I don't have that time. So that's why I work within it and trying to push it forward. Next slide, please. So very touched on by Linda again, a lot of the issues that women face, in particular, I'm drawing on here from the flower supply chain. But also, these are the issues that women are facing constantly across the supply chain and across the world. Obviously in different levels in different countries, obviously, but as I've just put in there, but even in the UK, which is a well-regulated and certified and legislated country, that in 2015, 54,000 women lost their jobs because of pregnancy discrimination. So it's across the board, but in particular, obviously, the issues that we were facing within the flower industry were issues around sexual harassment, gender bias in recruitment, but the fact that their work was lower valued, that there were gender-based violence issues, and in particular, that has risen tremendously during the COVID pandemic. So those are issues that we're dealing with, that, you know, women's voices or voices of workers per se are not represented in decision making, but in particular women. As Linda has already mentioned, there's a lack of access to land and finances. They've got multiple caring responsibilities. There's some really interesting work on how women are invisible in data collection, in particular things around PPE, that the PPE is designed specifically for men. So there are issues around health and safety for women in the workplace. And again, that they lack those training opportunities in order to take them from those lower paid areas up into the higher paid management or supervisors. So I think for us in particular, we were talking about the fact that there are 70% roughly of women in flower supply chains working in the fields, in the farms, and that's what's missing a lot of the time from certification. So it was really good to hear that being mentioned within Linda's presentation. Next slide, please. So I think obviously David mentioned the issue around Portugal and the issues of the workers, which has just been put into The Guardian this morning. And just to put it into context, we've just had a meeting. So I'm part of a group called FNET, who meet every 2 weeks to discuss issues around human rights within supply chains, and that was actually brought up at the meeting with those named and shamed retailers on that meeting. So they immediately, Berry World has said that they will have a meeting. So it is there, it's been raised, and it's one of the issues around certifications and things coming to bite the retailers. So I think it's really useful for people to recognize that people are watching them. I suppose that's part of it. But on the positive side, as we've just heard, you know, that they are really useful in order to manage, evaluate and regulate that which is legally and socially acceptable conduct. Now, who determines who those or what is those legally and socially acceptable conducts is a matter for debate, and that is something that will no doubt be touched on in various discussions afterwards. Again, it's a risk management for the company, but as has been said time and time again, you know, if you are doing your job and your work properly, if you're actually doing that, then the certification and the audits are really just basically checking to make sure that everything's okay. So it should be embedded within the company. They're also used, certifications are used to persuade the public that whatever it is safe, be that food, be that a toy, whatever it is. Massive retailer requirements, so a big push, and obviously as a supplier, I'll touch on that later, but certainly there's a massive thing around the retailer requirements in the north. And again, that goes back to what is legally and socially acceptable. So it's being determined by those retailers. Yes, I think obviously Fiona talked about the multi-certifications and why on earth we need another one. So in some respects, that's positive that we've got so many, because they're covering different aspects within the supply chain. And, you know, whether they're social, environmental or quality. And for me, that is the one of the real bugbears, is the fact that we separate out those things. So if we're talking about sustainability, then for Christ's sake, would we bloody well put them all together? Because I'm sick and tired of people talking about, is it social sustainability? Is it environmental sustainability? One without the other is not sustainable. So they need to be put together. And the fact that Fiona was talking about that third-party verified independent auditors and who are trained, absolutely crucial, absolutely crucial. On the negative side, I've covered some of them, but there's an over-reliance on certification, which we've talked about. The fact that we're measuring those outcome standards rather than looking at the processes that are going on. Certifications, as we've already touched on, they can't regulate behaviours. That's part of what your company is doing. That's the very ethos of your company. You can certainly put in place some of the policies and the procedures and the guidance for your workers of what they should be doing, but it comes from within. It comes from the values of the company itself. Again, as I've said before, the northern market retailer focus, yes, it's got good benefits. There's been some fantastic changes within flowers because of it, but again, that's something that we need to look at. Hugely costly for the farms, and in fact some of the smaller farms are outsourcing into the larger farms because they can't afford to actually cover their costs of certifications. As we've talked about before, there's a minimal gender focus within most certifications. There's a lack of worker voice. Personally, I think there's just too many of them, and I would quite like to see some of them go. And is there one overall sustainability certification? And I don't know if it's possible. I've been hearing, obviously, from Fiona and Linda, that possibly that there is a huge push towards it. So that's given me hope. Next slide, please. So obviously, how useful are certifications? We're in a situation where we are obviously supplying now into retailers. It used to be in the back in the 90s, maybe 80s, a lot of flower growers were selling straight into the auction, into the market, into the Dutch market. It's now changed. The focus has now come onto much more of a retailer control. And as you can see, it's a bit like a sort of a retailer bingo. There are all sorts of different things that they've got, whether they are, you know, they've got ethical audits, whether they're in the high risk countries, whether Other ethical certifications are accepted, whether they want environmental as part of that. Some of them do, some of them don't. So there's definitely a huge sort of difficulty within the suppliers in order to reach all of those criteria. Personally, I think we should be doing all of them. We should be leading it as a company. We should be setting our own standards. And in order for us to then reach those retailer requirements, we would already be there. A bit like we've been saying about the fact that if your company is doing what it should be doing, you'd be able to reach those certifications and the audits, no problem. And it will be the same with the retailers. We'd be way and above what the retailers are requiring. Public understanding of all of this, very limited, apart from maybe fair trade. Fair trade has been one of the key requirements that people sort of pick on when they want an ethical product. And I've got quite a lot of time for fair trade. You know, it's very comprehensive, it's audit certification. What I like about it is it offers support to the farms above and beyond the certification process. Obviously, it pays the premium on top of for the community projects, but it's also been accused of continuing that dependency culture. It doesn't challenge the trade model that keeps those prices low. So for me, it's got a lot of positives, but it's obviously got some criticisms in it as well. And just quickly to say that on the rainforest again is changing. It's now putting into environmental and ethical, so it's now changing its logo in order to capture that. Whether it's good enough is another discussion to have. Next slide, please. So as well as obviously that scrutiny, there's also been looking at companies. So Know the Chain have been looking at food and beverage, in particular around forced labour. And I think the only company that I know that's within this review is Tesco's. But looking at that, food and beverage only scored an overall score of 28 out of 100. And as the Vice President of the European Parliament said, you know, the lessons drawn from this serve to highlight that sustainable corporate governance rules in themselves are not a panacea. Their effectiveness in promoting human rights and environmental regeneration in business operations and in companies' global value chains depend greatly on their design and on their implementation. Both of those have just been covered by Linda and by Fiona. So absolutely perfect. Next slide, please. And again, there was a very much a public focused condemnation of a lot of the retailers. So obviously Behind the Barcodes launched in 2018, trying to mobilize the power of the consumer, the power of people to help end some of these issues. And what's been really interesting is that because of things like the Portuguese exposure today, is that a lot of retailers are now pushing right down into the supply chain, into the suppliers, for them to own that human rights due diligence, which I totally agree with. You know, as we've said before, it's about embedding it within the culture of the company. I would like to see it as a human rights and environment due diligence, because obviously I'm all for knitting all of those things together. So next slide, please. So going forward, I think there is a real need to map some of the existing certifications and standards. So a lot of work's been going on in FSI around flowers. So we've been looking at the basket of certifications to see where they overlap and where they differ. So I think that's a really important piece of work. So we've just joined FSI, so that's really good. Again, there needs to be retailer agreement and alignment on what we need to do. Either that, or as I say, that we as a company or any company who's supplying into retailers needs to take it by the scruff of the neck and actually decide themselves, these are the criteria that they want, this is the highest level that we want, and hopefully everything will fit underneath it. So again, basically doing the right thing. They need to improve though, and whether it's us that needs to improve or it's the retailers, but certainly there were no green marks on that Oxfam chart. So none of those retailers have scored highly on the human rights due diligence at all. There needs to be an agreement on what on earth sustainable means. and what certifications give that assurance. And I think one of the issues is that we've got so many different logos that cover so many different things. And I think that there needs to be an agreement on what sustainable is. So I know that there are some people that are really pushing for grown in the UK, which is great. It might mean that there's been reduced air miles, but is it lowering carbon? Is it lowering emissions? You know, and who's checking the labour rights? So all of those sorts of things, there needs to be a real discussion about that. And hopefully with the setting up of a UK covenant around horticulture, that would be really useful for us to get to grips with. And as I said, the logo for the public to know that what they are purchasing is sustainable, or a series of logos so that people can actually decide. That worker voice, which people have talked about, and gender, they have to be an essential part of the audits. And that can be those old, which I think we talked about, so the social dialogue, or it can be new technologies such as the picture up there, which is of Ann Wider, which was the program that we used for mobile phone technology for people to phone in, a really quick and easy way to gather information from workers. So that was good. Fiona talked about that auditor training. There needs to be consistency across certifications and audits, because we just, you know, one auditor goes in and puts an NC on a farm, goes to the next farm, or another auditor goes and the same issue but isn't audited, it's not an NC. So there needs to be consistency. Collaborations between NGOs and companies, and Linda touched on that. I think that there is a lot of opportunity for companies, suppliers and retailers to learn from NGOs for the work that we've done on things like theory of change and monitoring, evaluation and learning. Some of those issues don't even touch the sides in companies. All they're interested about is the profit and making sure that shareholders get their money. So I think there's a lot of learning, cross-fertilization there. And I don't think certification is in its own right going to change anything. As I say, it needs to be from the heart, from within, but also legislation within those countries in order to enforce that company reporting. It has to be made legal and it has to be made enforced. So I'm all for the hard line on that one. And that's I'll end on that firm line and I will stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Caroline. And that draws an end, a firm line towards our speaking. So thank you to all three of you. Caroline there giving us a different perspective, but actually very interestingly that we've brought out quite a few commonalities here in terms of approaching to what certifications can and can't and should and shouldn't do, but also things such as the role of audits within that as well. So I am sure that there's lots of different things there to pick up on. So thank you to all three of you. So that means that we move on now, and we've got just less than half an hour for our question session, as well as discussion and debate, which we encourage as many as possible to take part of. So you are welcome to do this in two ways. You can pop a question in the chat function so we can see it and I can pick them up from there. If you would prefer to raise your hand and I can come to you and you can ask your own question, or indeed make a comment as well, that is fine too. So thank you, Paul, for starting us off. We have a question in the chat to start with. I'm presuming, unless Paul would like to come on, I'm presuming this is thrown out to all three of our speakers, asking about your experience. Do stakeholders ask about audit issues raised in audit reports? Are they interested or concerned? So yeah, I wonder perhaps if Linda or Fiona or indeed Caroline would like to pick up on that, about how important it is once these are raised and if they take forward.
Yeah, Jill, I'm happy to take a first stab. Absolutely. I think the transparency of audit reports is becoming very important. obviously for buyers and retailers, but also for civil society and trade unions. And we've had quite a lot of debate on how do you make audit reports available to trade unions to comment on. Obviously, trade unions that are organized on site as part of our process need to be involved in the corrective actions. But I think increasingly in terms of due diligence and new legislation which is being passed, retailers and buyers need to understand some of the root causes that are embedded in those audit reports. And for that reason, not only the audit report, but also the nature and extent and depth of the corrective action being undertaken.
Brilliant. Thank you, Linda. Fiona.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with Linda. I would love to see more transparency with regard to audit reports. But I think sort of a good audit process should always see an auditor looking at external feedback, customer complaints, and any issues that have been sort of raised by the local communities. So if that's been logged as an external issue on a complaints register, the auditor would look at that and would seek explanation about what it's about, how the issue had been resolved, how they'd worked in partnership with stakeholders. And similarly with internal issues, whether you're looking at a grievance procedure where a member of staff, a worker has raised a grievance, you know, that the auditor would look at, right, has the procedure been followed? Has it been adequately investigated? In the same way you'd look at customer complaints. But I mean, I think certification programs in general would probably, I think most would feel quite uncomfortable making audit outcomes available, in audit reports available, because it does somewhat open floodgates. Me as somebody who's interested in the area, if I could actually have a summary in front of me before I made a product as a consumer myself, you know, that said this company performs really well in this area and they're doing something about this area where they're slightly weaker, and they've got, you know, they're actually doing something to improve, I would find that very reassuring. But I think we've got a way to go. I think it's going to need somebody like the UN or you know, sort of like a big umbrella organization to bring in some kind of program where that might happen, so that it's fair and equitable, you know, kind of across all parties involved, I guess.
Okay, thank you for that, because I suppose it does speak to who we're talking about when we say stakeholders.
Yeah.
That transparency issue is an interesting one. Caroline, I'll just bring you in there because I wonder if that connects partly to what you were saying about the regulation and, you know, about that having that similar playing field through it actually being regulated, what is transparent and what needs to be reported on, perhaps.
So as an industry, obviously our target is that every supplier is on SEDEX. So that's the transparency bit where everything's on there. If there's a non-conformity, it's flagged up, and it's flagged up obviously to us, but also to the retailers. So that's when the retailers will come back and will then ask us about, you know, what are we doing? Have we got a corrective action plan that's been put in place and whatever? And we will do the same when we're going to our suppliers. So that visibility is there, but it is literally, as we've just been talking about, it's on those key areas that are being measured by that audit process through the SMETA audit. I think the issue for us is about that transparency out. So that is why those benchmarking from Oxfam and from Know the Chain, that is why that's happening, because that is where that visibility is not out there. Unless as a consumer, I would then purchase. So I will look for what I consider to be a sustainable business. So I'll be looking for a B Corp. So that is what I would be looking for. So it's an understanding. So I understand that. If I go down to, you know, I don't know, the local supermarket and ask someone, you know, do they, when they're buying flowers, are they looking for the sustainability mark or the fair trade or whatever? I think most of them would look at me with a bit of a confusion. So understanding the market and understanding that transparency and where it is and who it's going to is absolutely crucial for me, but whether it's crucial for everybody, I'm not sure.
I think that's a good point. I think I have tried that in different settings, as to ask different people what this actually means, or is there anything there? And you're right, it's information for a certain number of people in certain settings, and it brings in quite a few questions about the role of the consumer in this. However, our questions are coming thick and fast. I have Shantanu for your question next, and then we'll go to Hussein. Shantanu, thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and my question is about these too many certifications on different issues. And I can imagine for food it's very difficult, you know, food traveling many miles and so forth. But for wine, it's a bit more simpler, I think, because the wine is grown basically from the region where you are buying the wine from. And I'm wondering how, for wine, as Linda mentioned, that some Nordic countries have these certifications for good practices on the labor issues. And I'm wondering how are customers really looking at that? Because for wine, I know it's common to have organic wine, is very common, but are customers really recognizing the fact that also they want to buy wine that is produced, from farms where labor practices are very well commended? And how do retailers or even restaurant associations feel about that? Because, you know, for wine, they're not just retailers, but even restaurant bodies may be buying the wine. And one thing that they probably think when they buy the wine is that, okay, I mean, would consumers like it? Or would they be willing to pay some more money for that, right? So I'm a marketing professor, so I'm thinking a bit on that angle. But I think this is a very fascinating thing to look at, you know, in terms of, are people willing to pay, or how do they recognize certification for fair labor practices also, in the instance of wine, for example?
Thank you for that. Linda.
Thank you. It's such an interesting question, because many of the retailers, the Scandinavian monopolies, have very, very good codes of conduct when it comes to ethical trade and social responsibility. And the consumers are aware of that. And so when they start to having to distinguish between a wine that has a label on and a wine that doesn't, obviously the first thought in their mind is, well, aren't they all ethical? You know, and what makes one more ethical than the other? So it's controversial, you know, when you start to put a label on, because then you've got to build in a lot more assurance around that. You've actually got to tell the story around why your wine would otherwise be different. And some of the retailers and monopolies, particularly in Scandinavia, have started to do all that, where they have a basket of possible certifications, and they've put them all under one label. But I think in terms of the internal due diligence that they need to do, it is exceptionally important. You mentioned maybe fruit is easier, fruit is more difficult, wine is simple. Wine can become very complex, especially when you're looking at blends. You can have 100 different farms' grapes coming into one bottle, and it's trying to ensure that you have located the source of each one of those bottles. We do think there needs to be a lot more consumer education around what labels mean, what they mean in comparison to fair trade, because everybody is familiar with fair trade. So there is a lot more that needs to be done. On the issue of pricing, interestingly enough, South Africa, if you're interested in wine economics, is priced at the lower end of the price points, despite the fact that it's got very good quality wine. And that's because it made a very strategic faux pas late in 1990 when the markets opened, and they said, we're going to produce high quality wine at low prices to get into the markets. And that's stuck with the consumer. And so the consumer, when they look at South African wines, they don't necessarily want to pay more despite the quality. However, there's been quite a lot of research to suggest that they would be interested in paying more. I think the question, Shantanu, is where does that money go? And that's a key question for buyers is, would you be guaranteed that if the consumer did pay, a couple of cents more or a pound more for a bottle, would that go into the pockets of workers? Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a question that's come up in definitely other supply chains that we've been involved in, and that is actually quite at the crux of where the responsibility is as well, and how that feeds back. So I will just move on to our next question. We can always pick up more on these as we go through. We've still got about 15 minutes left, but Hussein, can I invite you to ask your question now? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Jill, and thank you from all the presenters for the very interesting discussion. So I have two questions. First one from Linda on indirect suppliers in global supply chains, because one of those key messages that Linda presented was social dialogue with all levels. So in supply chains, when we are talking about our direct suppliers or the suppliers of our suppliers, maybe we have a good visibility, good control. But when we go to tier 3, tier 4 and beyond, there's usually very little that the buyers know. So my question here is, how do you think we can bring those indirect suppliers around the table and have a discussion with them, and how to increase our visibility and control over those indirect suppliers, which might be located in a very remote area. And then the second question from Fiona or Caroline is about the audits. So I was wondering to what extent when we're designing these standards and certifications, do we incorporate the announced versus unannounced audits? Because the reason I'm asking this question is that I've seen a couple of cases and examples that when there is an announced audit, the factory or the organization that is being audited, they arrange everything as if it looks perfect, and then when the auditors go away, everything goes back to normal, which usually includes exploitation of women and other issues that were mentioned. So to what extent that's the audit being announced or unannounced is seen in the standards that are being developed? Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. Perhaps if we take the first one with Linda first then. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. I want to say that I think within the South African wine industry, we're quite fortunate because you can't produce wine without registering with the South African Wine Information System. So if you are producing wine grape, if you are transporting that grape, if you are harvesting that grape, if you are registering it with a seller, all those different steps, you need to be registered with the South African Information System. And indeed, we don't accept any producer that becomes a member of our certification scheme until they are in fact registered on the system, and all their farms can be registered, all their blocks of vineyards can be registered, which means that we have great visibility right down to the bottom tier. But I think that's something, the wine industry players talk about a world-class system, and that's certainly something which you won't necessarily find in other wine industries. And perhaps that's something that, the wine industry needs to talk about a lot more is this amazing information system. But talking to, indirect suppliers, covert has helped a lot. One of the biggest issues we've had is actually getting out to farms in remote areas. And we've certainly got a lot of farms out in the Northern Cape that we haven't been able to engage for the longest time, until we all got into Zoom and Teams. And it's been amazing how, you know, technology has enabled us to be able to have capacity building programs with workers. We've done amazing training with chemical handlers on safe pesticides use. We've had women's capacity building sessions just through the use of technology. And I think we underestimate, when we're dealing with outreach areas, we underestimate the extent to which even workers are able to start communicating. I think we spoke about and wider. We're having some workers reporting, many farm workers have got smartphones. They're actually able to report on a quarterly basis on working conditions. And I think that's something that, you know, as certification schemes, but certainly as buyers and retailers also need to look at how we can encourage the use of technology in actually opening up a wider debate and allowing people into the conversation more. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. And I think your example with the wine industry does show, particularly in South Africa, how these issues can be different for different types of supply chains and within the same types of products, depending on where you're talking about as well, with different rules and regulations and systems in place. So we will swiftly move on to Fiona and Caroline to answer the part about audits as well, to develop that part, if you would.
I mean, it's an interesting point about audits, and certainly with the ETRS standard, we went for unannounced audits within a given window. So for all audits that take place on that standard, the site knows that the auditor will arrive within a 28-day window, but they don't know exactly when. So so there is it's not a perfect system, unfortunately. It's something that's very, very difficult to manage, but at least you do get a clearer picture by running an audit that way. You know, if the auditor appears on the doorstep and isn't allowed in by a site, that's a flag, isn't it? That's a red flag. You know, they've got certification, needs to be suspended, because obviously something is going on that, you know, kind of makes us suspicious. If the auditor isn't given any, if the site isn't given any notice and the auditor arrives, they haven't got time to get those double books out, you know, that capture working hours. They haven't got time to kind of prep people and coach people. The bad sites, I'm not saying everybody does this, but the bad sites that aren't doing things the way they should be doing things. I mean, I will say there was an instance, no system is perfect. There was an instance in the UK that was reported from a fashion retailer, from a fashion manufacturer. Fashion manufacturers in a part of the UK who were in a cluster in a city, who actually set up a WhatsApp group, and when they saw a stranger who might be an auditor going into the area, they would get onto the WhatsApp group and say, by the way, we think there's an auditor in the area, you need to be really mindful if they're coming to you. So these were competitors, but they joined this WhatsApp group. So of course, when the auditor announced themselves, you know, all the whitewash that could be used by unethical companies was immediately put in place, you know, and the people that shouldn't have been on site because they've been working for like 18 hours previously were all rustled out the back door. So if a site is behaving unethically in the first place, they will find ways around audits, whether they're announced or unannounced. But I agree, unannounced audits are really the way to go, because you do get the truest picture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, so in the flower industry, we are bound by the rules and regulations of obviously the retailers. So that's one of the things that we have to do. So it has to be a semi-announced. So going back to that sort of time frame within which the auditor can actually go in. So it's always a semi-announced. If there's any change in that, we have to get permission from the retailers. So in particular around COVID, obviously there was an issue around the fact that there were controls that were being put in place on the farm. So they needed to know when that person was coming. So it relaxed a little during COVID. And the certificate, as I said in my presentation, the certifications that were required are determined by the retailer, and also who the auditors are. So we have a list of approved auditors that we are allowed, or the farm is allowed to bring in. So as I say, it's very much controlled by the North, by the retailer at the moment. But yeah, so yeah, big area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to stay with audits just for a second, because we've had a question in the chat. Linda, I wonder if you could address that just very briefly, just on terms of the sustainable remedy from the audit reports, just to say a little bit more about that.
Yes, so the difference between remedy and corrective action is that corrective actions are often shorter term interventions that the company would need to undertake in order to address closing off the audit. Remedy for us is where you start to need behavioral change, which often takes a longer time, and where you need to look at restoring relationship, and this could take years, you know, and so it's not even a longer term corrective action. It's about ensuring that, you know, people's dignity are restored, that relationships are restored, and that behavior change. You spoke earlier about, very often it's about mindset, and abuse is based on bad behavior that you just can't switch on and off by signing a commitment to, you know, behave better in the future. And so the remedies are often requiring intervention. It often doesn't come from internally. It often does require mediators to assist. It often requires social workers or assistants or some form of capacity building to address both healing on the community and the worker side, but also address behavior modification, adjustment, and then that healing process to take place. And that's what we mean by remedy. It happens often in cases where you have physical harassment, in cases where women suffer abuse, and we have to get counseling in over a longer period of time, issues where whole families have been displaced and evicted, and are then put back onto farm. It could potentially happen in a forced labor case where you just can't remove entire extended families because there aren't sufficient safe houses to house them. And so that's what we essentially mean by remedy.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. Now, Alex, who had a question, has had to dash off to teach. However, looking at his question in the chat, I think we can take the last two questions sort of together, because Alex is asking us about that trust element of how we can trust these certificates. And we have Lahandi, who is asking about the role of consumer education. And I think this comes back to the understanding that people can have of what these certificates mean, and then also how much they're able to trust or believe them. And one thing that I've been fascinated by over looking at certificates over a long period of time now is what a difference there are between certifications. I mean, listening to Fiona, Linda, and you, Caroline, today about the different elements involved in some of the audits and setting up certifications and the bodies involved is so incredibly, so much work and so many layers, compared to some certifications that could well be very simplified versions of more as a code of conduct that you pay pay a scheme to belong to and then get the logo. So let's just take it back to the role of the consumer then. Who is it that should be educating the consumer, and how is that going about so that they can trust and know which ones to trust? Thank you. And each of you, I'd love an answer from briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. I will be brief. The role of educating consumers. Well, I think it's the scheme, the certification programs role, really. And what I have to say on that is schemes like the Forest Stewardship Council, it took them somewhere in the region of about 25 years to really get into consumer consciousness. Similar time frame for other marks like Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade as well. So it's expensive. I think we have a march now, though, in terms of consumer consciousness. I think consumers are very much more aware, and they are basing consumer, purchasing decisions on information that they're finding. So I think, schemes need to be proactive about this. If they really want their marks to be used in this way. I mean, I have to say that the scheme that I worked on at the RCGS was not consumer facing, and there was never an intention whilst I was there that consumers would use it as a way of differentiating products. But if they were to go in that space, then that's a consumer education program, that's marketing. You've got to put marketing effort behind that, and that okay. is an expensive process. But if that's what you want your mark to do, then that's what you need to do. So yeah, that's
okay. Thank you, Fiona. And Linda, if I come to you just for a last word from yourself before Caroline.
For me, what's important is that the consumer isn't going to trust any scheme. I think we've got to work as a collective. I think there is a role for the retailer, the buyer, the scheme, as well as workers and NGOs and trade unions to come together. When we see people working as a collective, and where we see that there has been measured change and we could tell those stories, I think that's when the consumer will be ready to actually trust in certification schemes once again.
That's a very strong point. Thank you, Linda. And Caroline?
Yeah, took the words right out of my mouth. Absolutely. I think the issue is that we've got a rising consciousness within the consumer, which has been exacerbated by or improved or whatever by COVID, because they've actually realized the difference in the supply chain. But there's also, for me, the big one is the climate change. So there's been a lot of change within the youngsters and the fact that they're actually questioning things now and really digging into what do people actually mean by that, and really going in and saying, actually, this is not acceptable. We want a change, and particularly we want a change around climate change. And that is the issue. So the climate crisis is going to be overriding a hell of a lot of the things. And you're totally right. It needs to be a collective through the retailers, through the certification people, through the NGOs, through the unions, etc., etc. So all of those need to be part of that. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think that is a great note for us to end on, because within this meeting, we have already been bringing people together from these different elements, but we just need to continue these conversations. I could listen to and take part in these debates all day, but I would like to thank everyone who has taken part, everyone who's contributed to the chat. Sorry if we didn't get exactly to all of the points, but we've squeezed as much as we can in for this time. And so thank you to everyone. Dave, I didn't know if you wanted a last word on the fact, but I also thank you for inviting us all. Thank you.
Sorry, Jill, can I just, sorry, David, just to interject. I'm more than happy, and I'm sure Fiona and Linda would be, to answer any of the questions that are in the chat, and we can just, give that back to people if that's useful.
That would be incredibly useful. I think most of them by now are comments and reactions to that, so please do have a look through. We managed to pick up on so much, and I can see from those comments how engaged people have been and all the thank yous that are coming through as well. So I'm sure that people will be following how this debate continues, and definitely we need to keep talking. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Jill, thank you so much for your wonderful chairing, so flexible and nurturing of our wonderful panelists and indeed the audience. Thank you to everybody who's still here and to the other 20 odd who've had to dash off to do other things. It's been the most spectacularly intriguing session, and it's just great to get information, you know, from people who are at the coalface, you know, are working with this stuff day in, day out, and having to adopt different stakeholder perspectives in order to deliver and to try and change the world for the better. So thank you to all three of our panelists. You've been every bit as good as I hoped you would be. So thank you for actually managing to achieve that this time of year. It doesn't apply to you, Linda. You've got a nice time of year. And maybe we'll bring you all together again sometime for part 2, because I think this could go on forever. So everybody, thank you so much for coming along and participating. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you and have a great afternoon.